All right. Welcome back to my reading of the Swiss Family Robinson. I'm going to continue reading this book that I started last time. And we left off at chapter 4 last time. We read through chapter 4. And now I'm going to be starting chapter 5, which is called Building a Home. The next morning brought new challenges. Elizabeth wanted to move to the tall trees of the forest immediately, while I felt we should first build a bridge over the river. This way, we could cross over easily with all our animals and belongings. "A bridge!" exclaimed my wife. "But the donkey and cow will carry everything we own on their backs." "Yes, but they'll have to swim across the river and everything will get wet. We must build the bridge." The new project would require planks and timber, which I could only get from the wrecked vessel. I prepared the boat for another journey. This time, I took with me Ernest as well as Fritz, so we could finish our work in a shorter time. We rowed stoutly until we were beyond the bay, but scarcely had we passed a little islet when we saw a great number of seagulls and other birds. I wondered what could have attracted them and steered for the spot. I brought the boat to anchor with a heavy stone, and we stole softly up to the birds. They surrounded an enormous fish, which had been thrown there by the sea. "I believe," said I, "that this is the very shark Fritz wounded yesterday." "Yes, yes, it's the same one," said my young hero, skipping about for joy. I saw lying on the ground some planks and timbers. They had been ripped from the ship and driven here by the current. These would do well for our bridge. We bound the planks together like a raft and tied them to the end of the boat. In 4 hours, we were ready to return home, without having to risk boarding the wrecked ship. We once more landed safely on our shore and unloaded all we had brought from the islet. But how would we get on the end of the timber across the stream so that it would lay over the water? First, I attached a cord to one end of a long plank. I then tied this cord around the trunk of a tree on our own side of the bank. I then fastened a second cord to the other end of the plank and harnessed the donkey and cow to it. Finally, I sent the animals running. As they moved across the stream, they drew one end of the timber to the opposite bank. When the plank lay across the water, Fritz and Jack leaped on it and, in spite of my fatherly fears, crossed the stream joyfully. It was a narrow but effective bridge. The first timber thus being laid, the rest was much easier. A second and third were fixed. We laid some short planks across them, and our bridge was completed. By now, we were too tired to do anything more that day. The evening was beginning to set in, and we returned to our home, where we ate an excellent lobster dinner and went to bed. As soon as we were up and had breakfasted the next morning, I directed my family to load the animals with sacks, including tools, kitchen utensils, plates, and hammocks. We packed and placed in the tent for safekeeping everything we were to leave behind. Elizabeth said, "We must not leave my enchanted bag," she said, smiling, "for who can tell what may pop out of it?" I placed our little Francis on the donkey's back, for he was too small to walk so far, fixing the enchanted bag behind him. Elizabeth led the way with Fritz. Then came the cow and donkey. Next, the goats, conducted by Jake. The next morning, when Jack had named Master Nips, was seated on his back. After Jack came Ernest, conducting the sheep. I brought up the rear. The dogs pranced back and forth as if accompanying a troop of soldiers. At last, we arrived at the place of the giant trees. The lowest branches were some 40 feet in the air. Good heavens, what trees! What heights! What trunks! Exclaimed one and all. They were tall fig trees with sweet, good fruit. As the fruit ripened, they would attract birds. We could hunt these and furnish our table with dishes fit for a nobleman. I gave the boys permission to hunt to their heart's delight. My dear wife, it was you who discovered this beautiful place, I said. We will fix a tent large enough for all of us in one of these trees, which will keep us safe from wild beasts and provide us with many comforts. I singled out the highest fig tree for our home. While our dinner was cooking, I made some arrows. I found some stalks of bamboo and used their hard, pointed ends to serve for the tips. Then I attached some bird feathers to the end to make them fly straight. I now set Fritz and Ernest to work measuring our stock of thick ropes. These would help us to build a ladder so we could climb high into the trees. I tied a strong cord to the end of one of my arrows and shot it so that it would hang over one of the largest branches of our tree. We would then be able to raise our ladder by attaching it to the cord and drawing it up once it was completed. We all set to work eagerly. Ropes would serve as sides of the ladder, and pieces of sugar cane would be nailed in as rungs. It did not take long to complete it, and we looked on it with joy and astonishment. I then tied it to the cord which hung from the tree and pulled the far end until our ladder had reached the branch. Everyone shouted joyously. All the boys wished to be the first to climb it, but I decided it should be Jack, since he was the smallest. His brothers and I held the ends of the cord with all our strength so the ladder would not fall down. We had yet to tie it to the topmost branch. Our young adventurer tripped up the sugarcane steps with perfect ease. Soon, he took his post on the branch and tied the rope firmly to the tree. It was now night, and we gathered together for dinner, spread our hammocks in the tall roots of the tree, and fell asleep. The next morning, we had breakfast and fell to work building a tree house. We drew the necessary wood up to the heights of the branch by means of a pulley. We used these planks to form walls and a floor. I then made a sailcloth roof, which I spread on the thick branches above. It hung down on the sides, and I nailed it to the walls. At last, we were finished. We unhooked our hammocks from the roots and, using the pulley, hoisted them up the branch. They were soon hung on the branches, and everything was ready for the evening. We still had some planks remaining, so we set to build a large table and benches in the large spaces between the roots of the trees. This would be our dining parlor. In our new home, I felt as though we were in one of the strong castles of the ancient cavaliers, with a drawbridge for safety. We ate and then slept, our hearts peaceful and our bodies tired. Chapter 6. Naming Our Lands. What do you think, my good family, I said, of giving names to our home and to the different parts of this country? They all exclaimed joyfully that the idea was excellent. Fritz said, "Let us call the bay Oyster Bay. You remember the oysters we found in it." Jack said, "Oh no, let it be called Lobster Bay, because a large one caught hold of my leg." Elizabeth said, "Out of gratitude, we ought to call it the Bay of Safety." Father said, "Very good, it shall be the Bay of Safety. What name shall we give to the spot where we first set up our tent?" Fritz said, "Tent Castle." Tent House. Ernest and the islet at the entrance of the bay should be called Shark Island, for we found that animal there. And this place we have built in the trees should be Tree Castle. Father said, Rather, let us call it the falcon's nest, because falcons make their nest in large trees. The spit of land where Fritz and I looked for sign of our ship's companions should be called Cape Disappointment. The bridge I would name Family Bridge. All agreed, clapping their hands. Yes, yes, they cried. As the day advanced and the intense heat cooled, I invited my family to take a walk. We decided to go across the river to Tent House, then returned with new provisions by way of Family Bridge. On our return trip, we were tired, but the scenery was beautiful. We found prickly pears, which are good for eating, aloe plants, which are good for strong medicine, cactus plants, and the king of fruits, the pineapple, which we all ate with pleasure. I was also fortunate to discover growing in the clefts and at the foot of rocks the carota plant, which can be used for tinder or to make a strong kind of thread. I demonstrated the plant's usefulness to my sons. I took out my flint and striking it against the carota, instantly created a fire. The boys looked on with astonishment and soon began to caper about, exclaiming, "Long live the tinder tree!" Next, I showed Elizabeth the excellent red thread which grew on the underside of the leaves. "How fortunate it is for us," she said, "that you have read and studied so much." We continued on our way to Tent House. Upon arriving, we immediately loaded up many of the things we had left behind to return with them to the falcon's nest. However, there were things which were too heavy to carry, and I thought I should make a vehicle for their transportation. I had decided on Ernest for my assistant, thinking that his lazy temper needed hard work as a cure. We fashioned a sled out of the planks of wood and branches. We harnessed the donkey and the cow to our sled and returned to Tent House to bring back more provisions. The labors of the day had tired us more than usual. We mounted our ladder at an early hour and were soon asleep. I encouraged my sons to exercise regularly and practice the shooting of arrows, for it was important to increase their strength and agility. They practiced running, jumping, and getting up trees both by climbing the trunks and shinnying up a rope, as sailors do, to get to the masthead. I also devised a new weapon in which two heavy stones are tied, one on each end of the cord. These my sons could use to wound an enemy or any animal by flinging one of the ends of the cord at it and instantly drawing back the other. But if they wished to take the animal alive and without hurting it, they could throw it in such a way as to make one end run several times around the neck and the other end tangle the animal's legs so that it couldn't run. Fritz soon became quite an expert. We put many things in order at Falcon's Nest. A pair of young pigeons had recently hatched and were beginning to try their wings. Their mother was already sitting on new eggs. We planted the seedlings of fruit trees which had rescued from the trip. We captured a huge female bird called a bustard, though only after a great struggle, and only once had I thought to throw my pocket handkerchief over her eyes so that she could not see to fight. We made additional gourd vessels, for we needed dishes to hold water, collect milk, carry eggs, and the like. Fritz and Jack also used the gourds to make nests for the pigeons and hens. One day, Fritz and I took Turk to do some exploring. As we walked, we picked up some acorns. Different birds of exquisite plumage flitted about us. One was a blue jay, and the others were parrots, red or green and yellow. We next entered a pretty little grove. I recognized American candleberry trees, which were loaded with large quantities of berries. These, when boiled, would yield a wax-like substance, which, happily, we could use to make candles. Nearby were some unusual trees which resembled the wild fig tree. A kind of gum issued from the trunk and became immediately hardened by the air. Fritz took some, thinking it might work well as a cement or varnish. As he walked away, he frequently looked at this gum, which he tried to soften with his breath, but without success. However, he discovered that the substance stretched. It was rubber. This was indeed a valuable discovery. It could be used to make shoes and boots. Having made many exciting additions to our stores, we turned around and began traveling toward home. On the following day, Elizabeth and the boys begged me to begin waxing candles with the candleberry wax to make them. I worked hard to remember all I had read on the subject. I put as many berries as possible into a vessel and set it on a moderate fire. Elizabeth, in the meantime, made some wicks with the threads of sailcloth. When we saw an oily wax of a pleasing smell and light green color rise to the top, we carefully skimmed it off and put it into a separate vessel, taking care to keep it warm. We next dipped the wicks one by one into it and then hung them on the bushes to harden. We repeated the operation until the candles had become big all around. But there was far more to do than that. I had a great desire to explore the part of the island around Cape Disappointment. The entire family set out with me in full procession. We brought with us tools, food, and water in a gourd flask. It was not long before we reached a magnificent bay formed by the cape, which stretched far out into the sea. It was now evening, and we decided to spend the night in this enchanting spot. We built a little hut out of some large tree branches. But we were suddenly roused by the loud braying of the donkey. It was throwing its head in the air and kicking and prancing about. Then it set off at a full gallop. We sent the dogs after it, but they couldn't catch it. It was too dark to follow it. We decided to chase it in the morning, hoping it would not go too far. The following morning, we breakfasted on some milk from the cow, some boiled roots, and some Dutch cheese from the ship. Then Jack and I went after the donkey. We spent an hour following its tracks until we came to a tall ridge of rocks. We could find no way around it or over it. It separated our part of the island from we knew not what. This was only a narrow passage between the rocks and the river, and we decided the donkey had probably gone this way. We were curious as to what lay beyond the rocks, land or water. We passed through, then leaped on rocks across a deep, rapidly flowing stream. On the other side, we found land and the donkey's footprints in the earth. We soon petered out, and we were sure we would never find the animal again. It was a great loss. But we also saw with astonishment the prints of other animals, much larger than the donkey. We were so curious that we decided to follow the traces. They brought us to a distant, peaceful, and beautiful plain. By straining our eyes as far as we could, we noticed some moving specks. We hurried toward them to find a herd of wild buffaloes. I was frightened, but the buffaloes stood perfectly still with their large round eyes fixed on us in vacant surprise. None of them seemed hostile. All was well until Turk and Flora caught up with us. The buffaloes became terrified of the dogs and instantly set up in such a roar as to make our nerves tremble. They struck their horns and their hooves upon the ground. Our brave Turk and Flora, fearless of danger, ran into the middle of the buffalo pack and grabbed onto the ears of a young buffalo. And though the animal roared tremendously and kicked with its hoofs, the dogs held fast. Our only hope of safety was to frighten the buffaloes with our firearms. We fired. The buffaloes, terrified by the sound and the smoke, remained for an instant motionless, as if struck by a thunderbolt. Then one and all took flight until they were gone. The young buffalo still remained a prisoner of the dogs. I hoped to tame this captive and make it a substitute for the lost donkey. I attached a ring to its nose so I could lead it, and we turned around to rejoin our family. We repassed the rock and went through the narrow rock passage. Soon we were back at the hut. The next day we began our homeward trip. On our way, we loaded up our cart and the buffalo with more berries, wax, and rubber. When, after so many adventures, we arrived at Falcon's Nest, we experienced what is so often true, that home is dear and sacred to the heart. Our animals welcomed our return in their own noisy, happy manner. Chapter 7: New Discoveries. The next day, we began some business, which Elizabeth and I had been thinking of for some time. She found it difficult and even dangerous to climb up and down the Falcon's Nest tree with a rope ladder. A staircase on the outside, however, was unthinkable as the tree was too high and I didn't have long enough beams. But I had for some time thought of building a winding staircase within the huge trunk of the tree. I had heard the boys talking of a hollow in our tree, so I thought it might be completely hollow. The boys helped me examine it. They climbed to the top of the tree's gigantic roots like squirrels and struck at the trunk with axes. From the sounds, it seemed thoroughly hollow, but they soon paid dearly for their attempt. A whole swarm of bees, alarmed at the noise, buzzed forth with fury. The boys were stung and soon ran off, crying terribly. Elizabeth and I covered their wounds with earth to take away the smart. The bees, in the meantime, were still buzzing angrily around the tree. I waited until they had returned to their hive, determined to capture them and their honey with them. I blew smoke at them until they were all stunned. All became calm. Then we cut a hole out of the tree. We were filled with joy and astonished to see the immense and wonderful colony of insects. There was a huge stock of honey which the boys and I collected. I put some of the combs into a gourd, which, nailed to the outside of the tree, would serve as a hive. Then we assembled around our table and ate some of the delicious honey. We then returned to our project of the staircase. Now that we had gone inside of the tree, we could see that it was entirely hollow from roots up to the branch where we had made our home. In the center, I put in the trunk of another tree, which would be the support for my winding staircase. We attached planks to this trunk at regular intervals, turning them in a spiral. I cut a second door at the level of our bedchamber. All was completely perfect. We began thinking of making the rubber boots I had planned for so long. I filled a pair of stockings with sand and covered them with a layer of clay, which I had dried in the sun. I then poured the liquid rubber in between the two layers. When it had hardened, I emptied the sand and drew out the stocking and removed the hardened clay. When I shook off the dust, I had a pair of seamless boots, warm, soft, smooth, and completely waterproof. We were scarcely up one morning when we heard in the distance two strange voices that resembled the howling of wild beasts, mixed with hissings and sounds of some strange creature at its last gasp. I was uneasy. Our dogs pricked up their ears. From their looks, we decided it would be safest to load our guns. return to our castle in the tree, and prepare for an attack. At this instant, the howling was renewed, louder and closer to us. Fritz listened carefully, then threw down his gun and burst into laughter. He exclaimed, "Father, it's our donkey! It's come back to us!" I listened, and it was true. Shortly after, we had the satisfaction of seeing among the trees our old donkey, Grizzle. To our great joy, he was accompanied by one of his own species. It was a fine onagra, or a wild donkey. Without delay, I descended the ladder to Fritz to capture it. I got ready a long cord with a running knot, one end of which I tied fast to a root of a tree. Fritz took the rope along with some oats mixed with salt. Our old donkey instantly sprang forward to take its favorite food. The wild donkey was reassured by this, and it drew near Fritz. Fritz seized the opportunity to throw the rope around its neck. It ran off, frightened, but was soon checked by the cord. We provided both donkeys with plenty of good food to calm them. The flight of Grizzle had resulted in some good fortune. We called our new donkey Lightfoot, and Fritz quickly trained it and adopted it as his own. One day, when Fritz was out with Lightfoot gathering acorns, he discovered some long leaves shaped like swords. He brought them home as toys to play with for his youngest brother, Francis. For a short time, Francis was highly amused with the sword leaves, and then, like all children, he grew tired of his new toys and threw them aside. I examined the leaves more closely and found them to be made of long fibers. This was flax and good for making clothes. We could make stockings, shirts, thread, and rope. Fritz and Jack immediately went off to gather more. Elizabeth would oversee the production of the cloth, but we would all help. The next day, we began our work. We hurried to a marshy area and soaked the flax leaves in the water. This would make the stem soft and easy to peel. While it was soaking, we gathered wood, which we used to carve wheels and reels, and began to build a spinning wheel and loom. On this, Elizabeth could make thread and weave cloth during the next few months. The rainy season was coming, and the spinning would fill those many cold months to come. The weather, which had been warm and calm, became gloomy. The sky was often darkened with clouds. We spent our time in finding wood to store for the coming months, and in building shelter for our animals to weather the storms. We dug up a full supply of yams and roots to make bread, with plenty of coconuts and sweet acorns. As long as we had dug up the earth, we planted the last of our European corn and some palm trees. These would be watered by the rains and would sprout for us in the spring. We also moved our home in the branches to the spaces between the roots at the bottom of the tree. I built a shed with a tarred roof to save us from the rains. We stored our goods in the staircase inside the tree to keep them dry. Yet the little shed could scarcely hold us all. It was uncomfortable, and what's more, it smelled bad from the closeness of our animals. We were half choked with smoke every time we built a fire, and drenched with rain when we opened the door. The shed had no window, and we wished for sunlight. For the first time since our disaster, we missed the comfortable houses of our dear country. But what could we do? Though we were cold and cramped, we put our time to good use. Elizabeth spun clothes. I was writing a journal, recording the story of our shipwreck, which the reader is enjoying right now. Ernest copied the pages of the story in his fine, clear handwriting. Fritz and Jack spent their time drawing from memory the various plants and animals of the area, and one and all helped teach little Francis to read. We were content, if a little uncomfortable. However, we all agreed that we should never pass another rainy season in such a situation. But where could we go? Fritz now remembered his favorite book, Robinson Crusoe. He is our best guide and model, Fritz said. He cut himself a home out of solid rock, and he was alone. We are six. We can succeed. We all thought it was a wonderful idea. We would pass this rainy season where we were, but never again. Next year, we would be prepared. I can hardly describe our joy when, after many boring and gloomy weeks, the sky began to brighten. The sun to dry the wet earth, and the winds to calm. We left our dreary shed with joyful shouts. We quickly led the cattle to pasture and immediately began cleaning Falcon's Nest, which was covered with dead leaves, but otherwise unharmed. We were not so lucky with Tent House, however. The storms had beaten down the tent and carried away part of the sailcloth. The rest was covered with mildew. Our tugboat was smashed into pieces, but our handsome pinnace had been spared. Much of the gunpowder was wet and could no longer be used. That was indeed a great loss. It was of the utmost importance that we find winter quarters where our stores, our only wealth, would be safe. But I suspected we would never be able to imitate Robinson Crusoe. He found a cave, but there was none like it here. We would have to spend years chipping at the rock to make ourselves even a small home. However, we could at least save the rest of the gunpowder by making a very small opening in the rocks. Fritz, Jack, and I went off to try, taking with us pickaxes, chisels, hammers, and iron levers. We made so little progress the first day that, in spite of our courage, we were tempted to give up. We kept going, however. As we penetrated deeper, I was relieved to find that the stone was softer. It was more like dried mud, and we could dig it out with a spade. After a few days of very hard work, we measured the opening and found we had already dug 7 feet into the rock. Fritz removed the rocks and mud with a wheelbarrow and slowly built a terrace with them in front of the opening. I worked to enlarge the opening in the small rock, and Jack, the smallest of 3 of us, was able to get inside and cut away below. Suddenly, he bawled out, "Father, Fritz, I have pierced through." "Ha ha, Jack. Is sad as jokes again," I cried. "No, no," Jack responded. "I've hit a hollow." I hurried to look and took hold of the iron bar Jack had been using as a tool. I enlarged the opening and he had made. Beneath it was a huge cave, though it was too dark to see inside it. I quickly sent Jack to his mother to get some candles and report on what we had found. He returned with his mother and the 2 younger brothers. Then we entered the cave, each carrying a candle. The most beautiful and magnificent sight welcomed us. The sides of the cavern sparkled like diamonds, reflecting the light from our candles. Crystals of every length and shape hung from the top of our vault and decorated its walls. The floor was covered with a fine white sand, and the entire cave was thoroughly dry. We might have imagined ourselves in the palace of a fairy. The children wanted to make this wonderful cave our new home immediately, but their mother and I disagreed. We would stay at Falcon's Nest for the good weather. We would use our time to cut windows in the cave and to build rooms using large planks of wood. We would also build a fireplace for a kitchen and indoor stables for the animals. This grotto would be our winter home. That's the end of chapter 7. But what happens next, you will find out tomorrow. Thank you for joining me for chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the Swiss Family Robinson. I hope you enjoyed, and tomorrow I will pick off from chapter 8 at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to be reading at 4 o'clock every day from now on, except Sundays. Thanks a lot, and have a good day.